After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis and this is After America. Donald Trump is making the United States and the world much more dangerous. Just as Project 2025 promised, the Trump administration is rolling back controls on the use and proliferation of fossil fuels. Last week, the Trump administration dismantled the legal foundation for US climate regulations.
Under the process just completed by the EPA, we are officially terminating the so-called endangerment finding.
It's climate change. Because if it goes higher or lower, whatever the hell happens, this climate change, it's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion.
I will end Kamala's war on American energy, and we will drill, baby, drill. We're going to drill, baby, drill.
And as if the consequences of climate change aren't catastrophic enough, Trump's chaotic approach to nuclear weapons has again made headlines. His administration allowed the New START treaty between the United States and Russia to expire, removing the last legally binding limits on the two countries' nuclear arsenals. Last year, Trump mused about restarting the United States nuclear weapons testing program, and on Friday accused China of conducting their own tests. A nuclear arms race and accelerating climate change are direct threats to Australia's interests. The Australian government's reaction, though, illuminates the risks it chooses to care about and the threats it doesn't. It's pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into a suspect nuclear-powered submarine deal that is apparently essential for Australia's security. Meanwhile, it's actively undermining that same security by expanding our own fossil fuel production and tying Australia's defence ever closer to a morally bankrupt US administration that is steamrolling the rule of law at home and abroad. To talk about the Trump administration's nuclear risks and threats and the implications for Australia and the world, we're pleased to welcome a new guest this week. Jon B Wolfsthal is the outgoing Director of Global Risk at the Federation of American Scientists and a member of the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Jon served as Special Assistant to President Obama for National Security Affairs and is a former Senior Director at the National Security Council for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. From 2009 to 2012, he served as Special Advisor to Vice President Biden for Nuclear Security and Non-Proliferation. Jon, thank you so much for joining us on After America.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
The pleasure is all ours. Of course, we've asked you on the show in part to talk about the doomsday clock and the latest setting. And I wanted to start by asking you about some of the calculations behind that. One of the things that the bulletin specifically pointed to was the impending expiry of the New START treaty between the United States and Russia, which has, of course, since that decision has expired. Would you mind starting by just explaining to us what that treaty was and why this is such a big deal?
Sure, I'm happy to. And, I'm glad you found a nuclear geek that can sort of, open up this box. So I actually worked on the New START treaty negotiation when I worked for President Obama. New START is the most recent in a series of legal treaties negotiated between Washington and Moscow, previously with the Soviet Union and then later with Russia, that date back to the early 1970s. During the 1960s, we had a number of nuclear crises between our countries, and leaders recognized that chaos was going to kill us all, literally. And so they agreed that we needed to put some guardrails on the nuclear arms competition. First, limiting the growth of these arsenals and limiting defenses, because defenses, ironically, can spur offenses, and you didn't want to have that. And then eventually bringing these weapons under control. At one point in the 1980s, we had 70,000 nuclear weapons between the United States and Soviet Union. And we brought that down to about 7,000 today through negotiated arms control agreements. And so New START was negotiated in 2010. It limited each side to having no more than 1,550 strategic offensive weapons, long-range weapons. So they didn't control tactical nuclear weapons, not everything in the arsenal. But these were the big weapons that threatened to destroy both of our countries, and did that under verification. We had inspectors that went back and forth. We had data exchanges. And the United States has high confidence that Russia had maintained those limits, and Russia believes rightly that we have done the same. That has now expired. and both countries are legally free to build up and deploy as many nuclear weapons as they want. And that's the worry is that that will herald in a new era of nuclear tension and nuclear crisis and potentially nuclear war.
Yeah, it seems bad. And for me, John, it kind of...
That's the technical term for it. It's bad.
It's bad. And it does seem to add... I mean, we speak a lot about on this show about how President Trump has framed himself as a peace builder, but he's not, in fact, anti-war at all. He loves bombs. You just have to listen to the way that he speaks about them. And allowing New START to expire doesn't seem like the actions of somebody who's committed to peace building.
Yeah, look, if I could explain Donald Trump, I would. I can't. He's inexplicable. And I grew up in New York with Donald Trump, so this is not something new for me. He has these weird contradictions. Donald Trump has talked since the 1980s about wanting to negotiate away nuclear weapons. He actually volunteered to Ronald Reagan and said, I'd like to be your arms control negotiator. Because in the 1980s, this was the thing that real negotiators worked on, right? Arms control and nuclear weapons and defense treaties. He thought he could go from real estate deals into this world. And I actually know Ronald Reagan's arms control negotiator quite well and said Donald Trump was rapidly dismissed because the guy was insane. So he talks about wanting to get rid of nuclear weapons, but he's invaded Venezuela. He's bombed a number of countries with Israel in Iran, Nigeria. He's deploying troops again to the Middle East. So, he's no peace treaty wannabe. But he does, I think, recognize at its core that nuclear weapons are incredibly dangerous. But he also believes that instability and unpredictability is a strength. And when you combine nuclear weapons and unpredictability, it's, again, a very combustible mix.
My proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier. That's what I want to be, a peacemaker and a unifier.
Our lineage and our legacy hails back to Athens, to Rome, to Philadelphia, to Monticello. Our ancestors built the cities. They produced the art and architecture. They built the industry.
You'll find out very soon, but we're going to do some testing. Yeah, other countries do it. If they're going to do it, we're going to do it.
Okay, you can't clarify whether you feel received.
I'm not going to say yet. I mean, I know exactly what we're doing, where we're doing it, but other countries are doing it, and if other countries do it, we do it.
We want allies who are proud of their culture and of their heritage, who understand that we are heirs to the same great and noble civilization, and who, together with us, are willing and able to defend it.
I think it makes nuclear conflict less likely, and America will ensure that we have the strongest, most capable nuclear arsenal so that we maintain peace through strength. That's what this is.
You mentioned, John, there Ronald Reagan and Nixon as well, and Trump seems to sort of combine, or attempt at least to combine, elements of what they did. I mean, he will often use the phrase peace through strength, which is a kind of perverted version of the Reagan doctrine, I think. And this idea permeates through the new national security strategy. And it seems to be loosely based on a Reagan-like idea of deterrence. Do you think that's the right framing? Am I getting this right, or is there no explaining what Trump is trying to do?
There is no logic at work with Donald Trump and in this administration. I mean, we should accept them for what they are, which is a bunch of nativists, white Christian nationalists, authoritarians who believe that might make right and that they can manipulate the information ecosystem to come out ahead. And so far, they've been right. I mean, they have manipulated the system to the detriment of our system of rules. Deterrence predates Ronald Reagan. This is Bernard Brodie, who was involved in the early nuclear strategy developing in the 1940s, talked about the only value in nuclear weapons was that they would make war unimaginable because the consequence of war was so horrific that generals would have to avoid it. What he does do from Nixon, though, is take out this madman theory. Yeah. And if you think about, maybe your listeners will know or can look up a little bit about game theory, but, some of the early economic game theories from Thomas Schilling talk about this, that basically deterrence is a game of chicken. If you have two people driving head first at each other on the highway, the first one to swerve is thought to be the loser, but of course it requires some sanity. But if both drivers are drunk, or one driver's drunk, it forces the other one to be cautious. Donald Trump thinks that if he can play the drunk madman, the other country will have to swerve. But of course, we have Donald Trump against Putin and Xi, both of whom have played the strongman card longer and better, and aren't really, they're even less accountable to their population. So I think there are elements that are woven in there, but my head hurts trying to come up with a theory for Donald Trump other than his ego.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that, and we've said this before on the show, there is no subtext. It is what it says on the box, unfortunately. But you mentioned, of course, that you have long experience of diplomacy and the very complex negotiations that go into agreements like New START and other non-proliferation initiatives. Given what you've said about Trump, how much do you think diplomacy and negotiations have changed from a US perspective? Because, of course, in these negotiation scenarios, we're not just dealing with a president. In fact, rarely are you dealing directly with a president. How is the administration handling these kinds of negotiations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we're also here in Washington trying to interpret how we called it the interagency when I was part of it. It's now how the different factions in the administration are actually wrestling with these issues. When Donald Trump himself focuses on something, the yes men and sycophants around him play bunch ball. So, he's obsessed with Venezuela. Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, was very involved in developing Venezuelan policy. Hegseth comes along, the Secretary of Defense, because he doesn't want to be left out. And then all of a sudden you have an interagency process. Tulsi Gabbard, who is the former congresswoman who's our director of national intelligence, is on the outs with Donald Trump, but found out that Donald Trump was reobsessing about the claims that the election of 2020 was stolen. And so she actually participated in a raid to get ballots from the state of Georgia, and she's now back in his good graces. And so,
is that what happened? Okay.
Yeah, so it's very weird, but
Yeah.
those are the people we're dealing with. So on things like New START, now that it was in the headlines, right? New START was expiring, and actually some members of Congress expressed concern about this. Like, how could we not have some sort of process? And Vladimir Putin called him up and said, like, I've offered to extend this treaty. Like, why aren't we doing this? And on the sidelines of the Iran negotiations, where they had both Russian and American negotiators, the two sides got together. And apparently there is some effort now to try to keep these caps in place and maybe have some follow-on negotiations. But there is no policy yet. Donald Trump has said we can't do arms control unless China's involved. But now we actually have a bilateral agreement or bilateral conversation going on with the Russians in which the Chinese are not involved. So, nothing is set until the president says yes, and nothing gets done unless the president says go. That's not the way we normally work in the United States. It's not a sustainable diplomatic process. The good news is that the people in the United States government who know how to negotiate arms control agreements, who know how to verify arms control agreements, some of them weren't fired. Some of them were actually retained. And so there are some people there that can help this administration out of the box they've created themselves. And the hope is that they'll actually find some traction.
Okay. Of course, that requires that, people in the administration will listen to those people with skills, and there's not a whole lot of evidence that that is happening. And I do want to come back, of course, to Russia and China. But just before we do, I wanted to stick with the administration and the Secretary of Defense or self-styled Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, because you've written about him and his role and said that you don't think he has the knowledge base around nuclear issues. That's a pretty concerning assessment given, what he's in charge of. So how do you assess Hegseth's performance so far?
Poor, dangerously poor. I mean, he is ill-equipped to manage the largest organization in the United States. He's, I think, proven himself to be completely morally bankrupt in terms of the management of the men and women in the military that report to him. And he has not provided sound advice to the president of the United States or the conduct of U.S. national security policy. So it's an extremely dangerous situation. He's much more interested in fighting culture wars than in preventing nuclear wars. And so it is a grave, grave danger.
This administration has done a great deal from day one to remove the social justice, politically correct, and toxic ideological garbage that had infected our department, to rip out the politics. No more identity months, DEI offices, dudes in dresses. No more climate change worship. No more division, distraction, or gender delusions. No more debris. As I've said before, and will say again, we are done with that shit.
That said, we have this weird sort of secret in the nuclear world, which is that the Secretary of Defense has no role in ordering the use of nuclear weapons. For any other use of force that the president wants to engage in, if he wants to send soldiers to the Middle East, if he wants to deploy soldiers to Europe to protect the border, he has to issue an order to the Secretary of Defense. And then in writing, the Secretary of Defense has to communicate that to the combatant commander, whether it's Indo-PACOM or European Command or Southern Command. For nuclear weapons, the president can pick up the phone and bypass the Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and even the commander of Strategic Command, and call the watch officer at the Nuclear Command Center at the Pentagon and order direct strike. And so in the past, we've said this is a real problem, and we should have a more detailed chain of command. Now we can't decide, is it good or bad that Hegseth is cut out? The reality is that, it's an extraordinarily dangerous situation because very few people believe the president is of sound mind. He is not surrounded by thoughtful advisors. I do believe the commander of Strategic Command, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, both are very sober, capable individuals. I think they are trying to insulate some of the president's worst instincts from the nuclear system. But in the end, if they're issued a direct order, they will follow it.
Mm. Oh, it's pretty grim.
On the other hand, I'm sure that real estate in Australia is now looking very good for a lot of people in our hemisphere. We've always talked about people escaping to Australia and your little brother, New Zealand. Of course, the reality is that nuclear radiation doesn't respect borders, oceans, or hemispheres, and so there is no safe place should God forbid this happen. But we have to look for the bright silver linings wherever we can.
That's great. So we get all the billionaires that have facilitated Trump, if they can get here in time.
You might get some multimillionaires too. It depends, maybe
great.
they'll live in the suburbs of,
Lucky us, something to look forward to. Hey, alongside that, Jon, of course, with the expiry of New START and the general, environment around non-proliferation and particularly Russia's war in Ukraine, there are also I think quite significant concerns around other nuclear powers, namely Russia and China. The Trump administration has just accused China again of conducting nuclear tests or planning to conduct nuclear tests. What is the general environment, do you think, around those nuclear powers and concerns about proliferation? And it sounds like, increasing arsenals.
Yeah, I'll spare you and your listeners all the geeky nuclear wonk details. There's lots of places they can search, including at my organization, the Federation of American Scientists. I think the way I would broadly characterize it is that nuclear weapons are back with a vengeance. Nuclear weapons are seen now by not just the United States and Russia and China, but by multiple states as valuable tools, not just for international status and security, but actually for warfighting. The United States, Russia, China, UK, and France have all said that none of us could win a nuclear war, and therefore we should never fight it. But we practice fighting nuclear wars every single day. We require our militaries to do that. And so nuclear weapons are more central to our security strategy, both for blackmail, deterrence, and coercion. And more countries are getting the message. There's a reason that it's been hard to get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. It's because they weren't attacked when Iran, Iraq, and Libya were. And Ukraine. Countries in Europe and in Asia are thinking increasingly about their own nuclear options. You've heard about Poland talking about nuclear weapons. You've heard some of the Scandinavian countries. My God, the Canadian military said the other day that the only way for us to have true sovereignty is by having nuclear weapons. South Korea is interested in building nuclear-powered submarines. That's sort of a surrogate for building a latent nuclear program. And the Japanese prime minister is quite popular. She's a disciple of former Prime Minister Abe, and there's talk about Japan rejecting its nuclear allergy and considering nuclear options. So this is the world that we worked hard to avoid for 80 years. We've been largely successful in that effort because the United States had been a pillar of stability. And we provided our nuclear umbrella to many states, and we also backed the non-proliferation regime. If that tent pole collapses, as it appears to be doing, who steps into the breach? Are the British and French capable of doing that? Middle powers, the way Prime Minister Carney of Canada mentioned at Davos, which clearly involves Australia. What role will they play in this world to stabilize things so the United States has time to come to our senses, which I believe in the long run we will. The question is how much damage is done in the meantime. And are the tools of international law and the rules and norms that we've relied on still viable when that happens?
I'd really like to follow up on something that you said there, because I know it will have jumped out to our listeners in Australia around South Korea and nuclear-powered submarines as a vehicle to a nuclear industry. Yeah, I can see you know where I'm going. Australia, of course, has embarked on this program
Yeah.
of acquiring nuclear-powered submarines from the United States, and then through a design program with the UK and the US. Is that how you, can I ask you about that deal and how you see it, and if it is a gateway to a nuclear program?
So interestingly, I don't think so for Australia. But here's how I would put it. Australia is an advanced country. You have large uranium reserves. You've talked in the past about having uranium enrichment for civil purposes. You have a nuclear technology program. There are research reactors in Australia. So Australia is fully capable, if it wanted to have a latent nuclear program, of doing so. And if Australia wanted to build a nuclear weapon, if there was a political consensus or decision, it could. Probably within 10 years. It would cost you billions of dollars, but you're spending billions of dollars on submarines. And so, it's possible. Interestingly, as I understand it, and you and your listeners probably know more about it than I do, the goal of AUKUS was to ensure that the United States, UK, and Australia were unified in a defense strategy in deterring Chinese expansion and undermining the rule of law in the Pacific.
It's not, I mean, it wasn't ever said explicitly, but yes, that's the aim.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it also gives Australia defense capability so that it can operate, at a blue water navy and take on Chinese capabilities if necessary. But really, what this was about was alliance management. That worked until the United States went bonkers and decided we don't care about our allies. Now, you may be better off. President Trump's animus seems to be geared towards the Europeans. He's bought into this narrative that the Europeans don't pay enough. You're not part of NATO. You're not part of that formal defense strategy. So maybe you're not going to take as much of the brunt. And quite frankly, most Australians are white, and Donald Trump seems to favor white Christians. Again, and look at South Africa and the refugees we bring in from there. So you may be spared that ire, but South Korea is different. And South Korea is different because when they say nuclear-powered submarines, they mean we want to have the ability to enrich uranium so that if we have to build a nuclear weapon quickly, we can. And they talk openly, like there's popular support in South Korea for having nuclear weapons. I actually don't know what the prevailing political view in Australia is of nuclear weapons. Obviously, there's a legacy of nuclear testing there, which influences the way the public view it. So I think it is different. A nuclear submarine is not automatically a nuclear weapon. But if the Australians if you are going to enrich your own uranium, then there really is no difference between doing it for a reactor and doing it for a bomb. It's just the shape that it's in. For South Korea, they want to enrich their own uranium. That is a going in position. And so that raises more concerns.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. You mentioned there the United States going bonkers under Trump, which is a nice way of putting it. And of course, the Trump administration is overseeing really a breakdown, and a deliberate one, in international law and norms. The doomsday clock is closer than ever to midnight, and it keeps getting closer to midnight, and things keep not changing or getting worse. It's perhaps an unfair question, but what do you think that other non-nuclear states, and particularly allies of the United States, like Australia, who are deeply concerned about what is happening in the United States, and that comes, I think, from a place of care and friendship. We care about what happens in the United States. We don't want democracy to collapse or for the Trump administration to keep making things worse. What do you think that allies can do in that sense to support, the democratic instincts of the United States?
First of all, thank you for asking. I'm old enough to have lived through multiple periods where the United States has deviated from our best instincts. The invasion of Iraq under George W. Bush, the bombing of Yugoslavia. The United States is not perfect by any means, and I don't mean to suggest that we are. We need our friends and allies. We need people to be vocal, and we need countries to unify and stand up and make clear to Donald Trump and to those forces in the United States that they are working not only against the interests of other countries, but of its own self-interest. In a way, we need somebody to throw cold water in our faces and say, wake up. And so how do you do that, I think, is the open question. When Prime Minister Carney talked about this at Davos, it wasn't to sort of wake up the United States. It was to bind each other together and to form a new, if not superpower, a new conglomerate coalition of the willing that could protect itself against these forces. I actually would modify that a little and say that unified, liberal, democratic states in Europe, in Asia, in Oceania can actually drive American policy and can stand up to Vladimir Putin and can stand up to President Xi. You have more people than we do. Collectively, you have a significant economic power. You do have important, if not dominant, military capabilities, and all these can be brought to bear. If you say, look, we want to buy American defense equipment and we want to keep buying American defense equipment, but we can't if we can't trust you. We want to keep buying American products and selling to America. We keep wanting to have, we want you to come and visit us and we want to visit you. We want to go to your schools. We want you to come to our schools. Those are things that when individually countries are cut out, oh, we're not going to let people from Australia, or we're not going to let people from Italy, independently, those countries can't stand up and fight. But we have seen time and time again when Donald Trump is met with a significant pushback from a unified front that he backs down. And I think I'm not advocating for allies to bully and beat up on the United States, but I do think for both self-interest and for collective interests, there is a role for these coalitions of the willing to come and engage the United States in recognizing what our interests are over the long term.
Yeah, and I certainly hope you're right. In Carney's speech and other indicators suggest that there is real potential for that to happen. And I think a growing recognition that it needs to, and that other countries, as you say, do have power and agency that we can use in our shared interests.
Yeah. And we're also, I'm generally an optimist by training. I work in nuclear arms control and nuclear war. So if you're not an optimist, you're an alcoholic. We have time and time again demonstrated that the American people and the American democracy can fix itself. And so we have a very big election coming up in 9 months' time, right? The midterm elections. There is now some hope, some speculation that because of Donald Trump's extreme policies and behavior domestically and internationally, that both houses of Congress could potentially go into Democratic control. The good news is that can be a real restraint on Donald Trump's power and his actions. The downside is that he may feel cornered and potentially lash out. And so we need both the Congress and the courts to hold. We are testing. Every generation must demonstrate its fealty to the principles of democracy, and we are being tested like no time before. And we hope to take some strength and solace from our friends who either have benefited from our example in the past, or maybe can keep it alive while we're deviating and try to restore it as we go.
Well, we'll be watching closely and with, as I said, great care and solace, I hope too. Jon, thank you so much for your time and your generosity in such a difficult time for the United States. We appreciate it so much, and we hope you'll come back.
That's great. If you're inviting me down under, I'm happy to accept.
Of course. Thanks, Jon.
Okay. Cheers.
Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode. The latest Vantage Point essay, What We Owe the Water, It's Time for a Fossil Fuel Treaty, is available now from Australia Institute Press. Written by South African human rights and environmental justice advocate Kumi Naidoo, the essay argues that Australia stands at a profound crossroads. It can continue to fuel the climate crisis as one of the world's largest fossil fuel exporters, or it can become a true partner to its Pacific neighbours and lead the transition toward a fossil fuel-free future. You can buy this edition for $19.95. Pod listeners can get free shipping by using the code PODVP, that's PODVP, at checkout. You can also become a subscriber to the Vantage Point series. For just $64.95, you'll get 4 engaging essays a year on some of the most pressing issues facing Australia and the world. Visit australiainstitute.org.au/store or follow the link in the show notes to order now. This episode was recorded on Thursday, the 12th of February. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.